So this morning it's my intention to talk about the US economy, but first, because it's GDP release day, I'll make a very brief comment on Australian GDP. Australian GDP is expected to come in year-on-year growth rate of 3% and a quarterly growth rate of 0.7%. My comment on this are two. Firstly, that this number enormously understates the power of the Australian economy. And the reason for that is that the way GDP is calculated is that the total value of output is divided by the GDP deflator. And as we all know, there's an enormous commodities boom going on. The RBA tells us that our export commodity prices are up 51% on average from the levels in 1920. So the actual value that's being produced by the Australian economy is vastly larger than the GDP numbers suggest. And the question of where the limit to that growth is, the limit of the growth is that labour force participation is the highest this century. The number of women working, the ratio of women working is overwhelmingly the highest this century. So we're running out of people to give jobs to, and that suggests, and that brings us to the next thing, which is the incoming government will generate an accelerated program of skilled immigration. And we will have, and they will announce, I forecast they will announce at least 160,000 immigrants, skilled immigrants in the next year, and that will add about 1% to the potential growth rate of the Australian economy. And of course, if you're worried about the housing sector, think of what all of those additional immigrants are going to do for housing demand. But I'll come back to that, analysing that area another time. Today, what I want to address again is the endless numbers of forecasts of the next US recession. About a month ago, I talked about how to look at the shape of the yield curve in the way that people could look at it themselves, and how to determine whether the shape of the yield curve forecast there was a US recession. And if you go back and read the piece or watch the podcast and go through the steps that I analysed, what you'll see is there is no US recession in sight. But I thought it would be a good thing to also talk about something we haven't talked about for a couple of years, and that's another indicator that everybody can have access to about the state of the US economy, and that's the Chicago Federal Reserve National Activity Index. And you can find this on the Chicago Fed website, which is chicagofed.org, chicagofed.org. And there's a new simplified display of this index, which is available and easier to interpret than the previous one was. The existence of recessions or the happening of recessions in the United States is not determined by the US government. It's determined by the National Bureau of Economic Research. And they used what is now the Chicago Fed National Activity Indicator as their method of deciding upon recessions until the beginning of this century. They had been using it for quite a while. And what it is 85 different indicators, broad indicators of the US economy. I started using this in 2008. It really is. It's even better than US GDP in telling you what's actually happening in the US economy. Now, the National Bureau of Economic Research in the US has, apart from this indicator, they've got 166 years of data, and they say that in that period of 166 years of data, there's 34 recessions, and if you divide 166 by 34. What you find is there's an average recession in the US every 4.9 years. Since the last recession was in 2020, that suggests that the next one, on average, should arrive somewhere around about the end of 2024. Now, our scenario is, in fact, for a soft landing at that time. We think that unemployment will rise in the US from 3.5% now to about 5.5%, and it won't actually go into recession. But that's about the length of the cycle. How can we know when that recession is approaching? Well, we can go to the Chicago Fed National Activity Indicator, and what we see shown in the commentary on the left-hand side of the release, which happens every month, is explaining what's actually happening in this series. There's 85 indicators, and it's rated according to standard error, which is the amount of variation. What it shows is that, on average, the indicator has to fall below minus 0.7 for the US to be in recession or about to enter a recession, minus 0.7. Of course, since it's a standard error, the average level or the median level will be 0. But above that, if you're going into strong growth, that is above 0.2. So, and we look at the 3-month moving average of the Chicago Fed National Activity Indicator, and the most recently published number for April 22 is not below minus 0.7, but it is above 0.2. In a matter of fact, it is 0.48. So what this tells you is not only is the US economy not about to entering recession, this very broad indicator of the US economy tells us that it is in a period of strong growth and will continue to be in strong growth into the foreseeable future. And so again, we have another indicator that tells us that the US recession is nowhere near in sight.